The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I continue to be endlessly fascinated with Rachel Dolezal, the former NAACP chapter president, who was pretending to be black, and I don't even know if pretending at this point is the word we're agreeing on. I'll talk to you about that word former NAACP chapter president as opposed to current in a few minutes, but I was riveted this morning, Lewis. She did an interview with Matt Lauer from the Today Show, and there were all sorts of just bizarre questions, and rather, I had the questions as a result of the bizarre answers that she gave, and it's becoming increasingly apparent that there's probably something pretty significant going on emotionally with Rachel Dolezal. We'll go through some of this interview. I have a few clips that I pulled out here. First is just the basic question from Matt Lauer to Rachel Dolezal, which is, are you African American? Let's get that on the record within the context of this interview. First, let's take a look at that clip to begin with.
Are you an African American woman?
I identify as black.
You identify as black. Let me put a picture up of you in your early 20s, though. And when you see this picture, is this an African American woman? Or is that a Caucasian woman?
That's not in my early 20s, but...
That's a little younger, I guess?
Yeah. I got 16 in that picture.
Is she a Caucasian woman or an African American woman?
I would say that visibly she would be identified as white by people who see her.
So again, Lewis, this same sort of wordplay, which is I identify as black as opposed to are you black, and really sort of dancing around this idea of race as a social construct, etc. And you know, what's interesting to me is a lot of the discussion around Rachel Dolezal and the reaction to her identifying as black has been from people sometimes hoping to point out some kind of double standard, saying, wait a second, David, you can't both believe that race is a social construct and that Rachel Dolezal can't simply identify as black if it's merely a social construct. And what's that, Lewis?
I mean, it's not that simple, right?
It's not that simple, exactly, because the idea of race as a social construct, of course, is based in part on the idea that we're all humans, right? And our origins all appear to go back to Africa. And the modern interpretation of race has been socially constructed. That does not mean that there are not differences between humans today that would fall under the sort of umbrella of what we call racial differences. And we also can't say, even if you're a full race is a social construct believer, that doesn't mean that there aren't implications to that social construct of race. So you're not really, the idea that that people are now being caught in a sort of a double standard hypocrisy around this is completely fabricated. That's really the false notion here, that there's an incredible double standard that you say, well, our origins are all in Africa, yet Rachel Dolezal was still lying. That is not a contradiction.
No, and I think it just doesn't make sense to focus on that. That's not really what the issue is here, and that's not helping us try to figure out what's going on with this woman.
So in the interest of trying to figure out what's going on with Rachel Dolezal, let's go to another question from Matt Lauer, which is, when did you first start identifying as black?
And this goes back to a very early age with my self-identification with the black experience as a very young child.
When did it start?
I would say about 5 years old.
You began identifying yourself as African American?
I was drawing self-portraits with the brown crayon instead of the peach crayon, and the black, black curly hair, and yeah, that was how I was portraying myself.
So it's
at 5 years old, Lewis. At 5 years old, she says that she started to some degree identify as black. And then I want to talk about that as well. Let me play the last clip for you here, which is where she explains that she's a black hairstylist. So that may be why some people identified her as black. It's kind of a weird thing. Like if sometimes I go to a barbershop where all the staff is black, but that doesn't mean that I think that everybody whose hair they cut is black, and I wouldn't misinterpret. I mean, just none of it makes sense, right? But here's her explanation there and her answer to whether she has changed her skin color.
not just at that time, but before then too, I have had to answer those who have seen me, and because I'm a black hairstylist, have styled my hair in many different ways, have been identified as mixed, light-skinned, black, etc. And I've had to answer a lot of questions throughout my life.
You've changed your appearance. Your complexion appears darker than it did in the photos of you as a young lady. Have you done something to darken your complexion?
I certainly don't stay out of the sun, and I also don't, as some of the critics have said, put on blackface as a performance.
Yeah, let me address that, because some people have said that the way you've changed your opinion is akin to putting on blackface. And Jonathan Capehart wrote in the Washington Post, "Blackface remains highly racist no matter how down with the cause a white person is."
So again, not really a clear answer, saying that she certainly doesn't stay out of the sun. And the entire interview was like this, Lewis. And what I came away from the interview thinking was just, this is someone who has some pretty serious emotional distress going on here.
That could be. I'm not really sure. It's pretty shocking to see that picture of her as a kid, and you see this clearly just a very white-looking young woman, and then to see how she has transformed herself, it's shocking.
All right, so send me your thoughts about the interview with Matt Lauer. We'll discuss that more tomorrow, but now let's get on to some of the news that has broken regarding Rachel Dolezal. First of all, Rachel Dolezal has now resigned her seat, her position as NAACP chapter president. She was, of course, accused of pretending to be black, and she said yesterday that she was going to step down. That's not the big revelation for me. The big revelation for me over the last few hours, 24 hours, is that Rachel Dolezal sued traditionally black university, Howard University, in 2002 for discrimination, according to court documents that have now been made public by the Smoking Gun. And this is where it gets really weird. She didn't sue because she felt she was discriminated against as a black woman, which is one element of the story she's told about her past, that she has been oppressed as a black woman, which she actually is not. But she accused the school of discriminating against her for being white. She says that at the time she went by Rachel Moore, which also I don't fully understand the name change. She claimed that Howard University and Howard professor Alfred Smith discriminated against her, quote, based on race, pregnancy, family responsibilities, and gender when she was applying to be a student in fine arts, and that they also denied her a teaching assistant post and a postgraduate instructorship because she was white. Ultimately, Judge Zoe Bush dismissed the charges in 2004. This is one of the most bizarre stories, Lewis. A woman who claims to be black, is white, at the same time also has alleged discrimination against her for being a white woman.
It is very strange. I kind of feel bad for her. I mean, she kind of brought this on herself, but can you put all of this aside and just say, has she been doing good work? Has she been doing good work for the black community? Can we just ignore this?
Well, let's take it in pieces. Has she been doing good work for the black community? I would say that absolutely those have been her intentions, and she has done many good things in her activism for the black community. But I would question whether the fraudulent, sort of usurping, deceiving, lying elements have maybe betrayed the trust of that very community that she claims to want to help, and whether that's sort of, it's just more of a pragmatic analysis. No, I don't doubt that her intentions were good, and of course I don't doubt that white people can be activists for any cause that it does not relate to their whiteness. No question about it. As I mentioned yesterday, you don't have to be part of the LGBT community to advocate and activate around that community. No question about it. I mean,
but I think people would be pretty upset if you started calling yourself gay and it turned out you weren't.
Well, that's the point, that I don't need to, right? I say I'm a straight ally of the LGBT community, and that's just absolutely the truth. And my status within that group is beyond reproach because I'm not lying about it. And that's really the issue. The fraudulent nature of her sort of framing is what may counteract some of the good she did and or may have done.
Yeah, honesty is the best policy. I think it was very foolish that she put herself in this position and that she thought no one would ever find out.
An update with the Duggar family. The Duggar family, of course, the stars of the reality show 19 Kids and Counting. They are known for being a Christian family that doesn't use birth control, which is how Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar had 19 children, including Josh Duggar, who has now been revealed to be a systematic sort of child abuser, including of his own sisters. We know that the family has been involved in anti-gay activism. We know that the family has been involved in anti-trans rights activism. And we know that the parents were involved in a cover-up of that systematic child abuse done by Josh Duggar. The latest news is that police in Arkansas were called to the home of Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar after they reportedly refused to cooperate in a child welfare investigation. This report was published by In Touch magazine. A representative from the Washington County office of the Arkansas Department of Human Services reportedly contacted 911 on May 27th. The DHS representative reportedly told the 911 dispatcher, quote, "We have an investigation, and I guess they're not being cooperative. We have to see the child to make sure the child is all right, so we just need police assistance." This also exposes that Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar didn't mention this when they were recently interviewed by Fox's Megyn Kelly about allegations that they were involved or somehow acted inappropriately here. There was, and Megyn Kelly didn't ask about it, so it wasn't necessarily the responsibility to say, by the way, on top of all this other stuff, we also blocked DHS from coming into our house. But the point is that it further exposes the hypocrisy of their framing themselves, Lewis, as, hey, we're cooperative, we're doing the right thing, we're doing everything we're supposed to do. According to this report, almost at the same time that this scandal was breaking, they were denying access to the Department of Human Services in Arkansas to see what the welfare state of a child was there.
Yeah, this is a family with a lot of connections, a lot of friends, and they probably thought that they could just have their way, that they could, use their connections to not get into any trouble and to avoid this type of thing. But, I think their world is kind of collapsing in around them.
Yeah, I think that the slow downward spiral is starting to happen now. It probably will take a little longer than usual because they're going to be able to suck every ounce of publicity out of this that they can, even as they're falling. And they're going to claw and scream and accuse and kick and bite and pull hair whenever they can. They tried to shift the blame to the police officers to the police chief for releasing the redacted police records, which of course was no crime, as we've since found out, framing themselves as the victims. There is no doubt that there is more to this story involving this family than what we know so far.
There's always more. And how bad will it be? How deep will it go? I wouldn't be surprised if there were some truly sinister revelations, coming up later.
Yesterday, after 6 months of, quote, actively exploring the possibility of running for president and raising a ton of money, by the way, former Florida Governor, Republican Jeb Bush, finally officially announced that he is running for president. He did this kickoff speech that was just completely pandering to the Hispanic community. There were all these Spanish-speaking artists. There were all sorts of Caribbean music being played, Caribbean songs being played. And then Jeb Bush, after like an hour of this nonsense, finally took the stage and emoting absolutely nothing. George W. Bush, nowhere to be seen, Lewis. Jeb Bush basically saying in a way that was completely uninspiring that he's running on his record as governor. That includes being pro-life. That includes opposing funding for stem cell research, being involved in the Terry Schiavo case where he overrode a family's wishes and reinserted a feeding tube into a woman who had been brain dead for 15 years. He was in favor of the death penalty. He reformed the death penalty to speed up executing people and making it easier to execute people. He signed a bill in his first year as governor which increased mandatory minimum sentences for juvenile offenders, an egregious act, given everything that is going on currently with our incarceration problem. He's running on that record, Lewis, which is a disastrous and abortive record.
Yes, we now know that Jeb Bush is not the guy we thought he was, and I don't really know what it's going to look like with his fundraising and who's supporting him. But do we still think that he is the guy who will be facing off against Hillary?
I do not think that he is. I think he has gone completely off the deep end. And if we're going to talk about the economic record in Florida becoming one of the states with the most inequality, if we're talking about jobs, whatever analysis we want to do, foreign policy, the guy knows very little about. Remember that horrifying attempt at talking about foreign policy a few months ago. Economy, disaster. Social issues, completely retrograde. Remember the story from last week where it was revealed that he advocated publicly shaming and ridiculing unwed mothers. Said he stands by that just a few days ago. It's insane. This is a guy who so quickly became one of the most extreme candidates that is currently running for the Republicans. And let's also not forget that earlier this year, he released, quote, all of his emails. And there are no emails related to a ton of major controversies. Of course, it's only Hillary Clinton's emails that we need to be concerned with. All of the Jeb Bush emails related to his controversies as governor, they were either deleted or on a personal email that is not part of the record. Not a word about that, Lewis.
Yeah, I don't expect to hear about that. I think he is, I don't know, he's done what he needs to do to appeal to the people he needs to appeal to so far. But yeah, I just hope he keeps talking, because the more he talks, the deeper he'll dig himself.
Bush 1, Iraq War. Bush 2, another Iraq War. Bush 3, I don't really want to find out.
Yeah, war against ISIS, maybe that's the next step.
Yeah, maybe that is. I'd like to just draw on the wise words, though, of George W. Bush when thinking about Jeb Bush as a candidate. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me, you can't get fooled again. And that, I think, is really what we should remember when thinking about Jeb Bush as a potential presidential candidate.
Yeah, it wasn't the prettiest quote, but we knew what he meant, right?
We certainly did. And it applies to Jeb Bush very, very precisely. That's for sure. Send us tweets about this, twitter.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Our program is funded directly by our audience through the David Pakman Show membership program. Go to davidpakman.com/membership to join today's new member of the day, John Jensen. John, thanks for being a David Pakman Show member. John gets all the great member benefits that you can read about at davidpakman.com/membership. Let's talk about our crowdfunding campaign. We announced some big plans for the show, trying to raise $50,000 in 50 days to expand programming, upgrade to a bigger studio, add an additional co-host, and so many other things. We're at almost $21,000 right now, 266 donors. The immediate goal is $25,000, 300 donors, and 30 countries. We're already up to donations from 24 countries, Lewis. U.S., Canada, UK, Australia, Italy, Mexico, Sweden, India, Indonesia, Germany, Norway, Japan, Denmark, Netherlands, United Arab Emirates, Finland, Ireland, Spain, Thailand, South Korea, Portugal, the Czech Republic, Malaysia, and an undetermined country in Europe. There must have been a problem with their IP address where the system couldn't pick up where they were. Almost 30 countries we are closing in, and it's just incredible.
It's huge. And it's, I think we could probably, what do you think we'll get to when it comes to countries by the end of this?
I think 30 is very reasonable.
I think 35. We still have a ways to go. And I think we could hit 35 countries.
You can donate at davidpakman.com/donate. If you can do $5, that's fantastic. If you can do $50, that's fantastic. If you can do $500, who's going to turn that away? And if somebody wants to drop in a $5,000 donation to get us over the halfway mark, I certainly would have no complaints, Lewis. Let me make that clear.
That would be fine. I would very much like to hit the halfway mark before halfway through the campaign. It would mean the world to me.
davidpakman.com/donate. The other day, Hillary Clinton made a comment where she said that the top 25 hedge fund managers in the U.S. earn more than all American kindergarten teachers combined. Right-wingers said that can't be possible. It's just not true. She's lying. Her exact words were, while many of you are working multiple jobs to make ends meet, you see the top 25 hedge fund managers making more than all America's kindergarten teachers combined and often paying a lower tax rate. People went crazy. PolitiFact decided to fact check it, and it seems that it is indeed true. According to a 2014 Bureau of Labor Statistics report, there's about 158,000 kindergarten teachers in the United States. This figure includes public and private schools. Their annual pay averages $53,480. That ranges from under $34,000 to more than $78,000. So the aggregate pay, average salary times number of teachers, is $8.5 billion. A little tougher to estimate the top 25 hedge fund managers and their salaries, but according to Alpha Magazine, the top 25 hedge fund managers reportedly earned $11.62 billion in compensation in the previous year. And I am told, Lewis, that that was actually an off year. So at minimum, we see that the top 25 hedge fund managers are making about $3 billion more per year than the country's 158,000 kindergarten teachers combined. It definitely appears to be true. How can anyone argue that that is a logical distribution of income?
A logical distribution of income? Perhaps not. But as someone who understands business and has a mind for finance, the amount of money that is being moved through these hedge funds, does it make sense that they are making this much money considering, just the sheer quantity of money that they are handling?
It does not, because if you put aside for a second the amount of money they are handling, if we evaluate the economic stimulus that hedge funds bring to our economy, we recently talked about this, although you might think abstractly, oh, but they're the kings of finance and they're moving all this money that is the engine of the economy. Untrue. The stimulative impact of dollars earned within the finance industry is very, very low relative to so many other industries. And let's not forget, by the way, that Hillary Clinton is right, but her own son-in-law, Chelsea Clinton's husband, is the co-founder of a hedge fund. And Hillary Clinton is not saying that rich people should not be rich anymore. What she is saying is that the distribution of wealth has become so unequal, so perverted, that no reasonable society can look at that and say this makes sense, particularly when we see the amount of poverty and hunger that is going on in this world and in this country. And let's not forget that last detail she mentioned, and often paying a lower tax rate. We should be discussing that too, and we have, as Warren Buffett has talked about. He pays a lower tax rate than his secretary.
Yeah, and this isn't a problem where you can just snap your fingers and have the distribution you want. It's going to start with much higher taxes for those people that we're talking about here.
And let's not forget that the majority of Americans actually agree with using taxation to redistribute wealth from the rich. That's not me as David Pakman saying that. More than 50% of this country agrees with that strategy. The average American woman now weighs as much as the average American man weighed in 1960. American men and women have both been adding pounds since the 60s, and now the CDC has released a study which shows that the average woman now weighs 166.2 pounds, nearly identical to what the average man weighed in the 1960s. U.S. men have also put on the pounds during the same time period. They are up to 195.5 pounds today. My first thought, Lewis, was, well, if people are taller now, that could account for a higher weight. And it is indeed true that about 1.5 inches average height has been added to both men and women since the 60s, but that is only a 3-ish% gain, whereas we've seen a 17 to 19% gain in weight. So this is definitely some disturbing data.
It is. It's mostly, I think, just the quality of the food and a lack of education when it comes to what we're eating.
So the CDC data shows that more than a third of U.S. adults over the age of 20 are considered obese. 69% of American adults over the age of 20 are either overweight or obese. And more than 1 in 5 U.S. children aged 12 to 19 are considered obese. So what has changed? The way Americans live has changed a great deal. More driving, more sedentary lifestyle, less athletics, less outdoor time. What people eat has also changed significantly. And the amount of calories that people eat is one that I have seen conflicting data on. Some reports saying, yeah, people in the US, Americans, are eating more calories now than in the 1960s. Others saying, no, it's not an issue of more calories. It's emptier calories that don't fuel, that fuel obesity. The implications are significant. Life expectancy can be held back. Healthcare costs are significant because not only are there more healthcare costs associated with conditions related to obesity and being overweight, but the cost in terms of medical equipment to treat those who are obese is also more expensive. And if you consider, well, you can imagine why that would be when it comes to specialized hospital beds or whatever the case may be. And if you combine this with that recent study we talked about, where parents increasingly don't realize that their children are overweight, this is a pretty big challenge that needs to be addressed.
Huge challenge. I can't stress enough how important eating the right foods is for everyone, for your mind and your body. And, I mean, there has been a huge, I don't know how to describe it. We have learned a lot about food over the past 10, 15 years, and people seem to be more health conscious than ever, but I feel like we've still barely scratched the surface.
I think nutrition and money management should be taught in all high schools, maybe even starting in middle school. Think about the impact that that could have, because as we see, a lot of these habits are sort of established pretty early on in life, and both money management and nutrition, why not, Lewis?
Money management and nutrition, I don't see why not. Let's throw in critical thinking too. There are probably going to be a lot of people who don't like the sound of all three of those.
Yeah, no question about it. We know Texas doesn't want critical thinking taught in public schools. We talked about that over the last couple of years. What do you think about this? Send me messages on Twitter, twitter.com/dpacman, and find us on Facebook, facebook.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Temple Northup, assistant professor in the Jack Valenti School of Communication at the University of Houston. He studies the impact of the media on our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, and actually has a very interesting study titled Effects of Long-Term Exposure to News Stereotypes on Implicit and Explicit Attitudes, which was recently published in the International Journal of Communication. It's so great to have you on. You know, we talk so much about where people's beliefs come from, particularly when we talk about discriminatory or racist or homophobic beliefs. And certainly we look at parenting and upbringing, but you looked at the impact of media. And what did you find, generally speaking?
Yeah, generally speaking, I'm interested in the exact same thing, right? When we think about discriminatory beliefs of any sort, there's not going to be one source of those beliefs. That's coming from a lot of places. And so my area of research is looking at that and how it comes from the media. And so in this particular study, I was looking at local television news use. And if you look at local TV, there's a lot of crime and there's a lot of stereotypes about who is committing that crime. And so I found people who watched more local television news tend to have more bias against African Americans, at least at the unconscious level, which we were measuring.
And how did you measure that? Talk to us about sort of the logistics of the study.
Yeah, so the unconscious attitudes were measured using something called the implicit association test, or IAT, and you can Google that as the best way to learn all about it. You can take one online, and it measures unconscious attitudes, and it can be anything. So some related to race, of course. You can do it between, presidential candidates, and you'll get sort of an unconscious, who do you prefer? You can do it young versus old. It can be really set up for anything. And it's basically a reaction time sorting task where you're sorting images, in this case of either white or African American people, and you're sorting things related to attributes, good or bad. And so you'll find that when Caucasian or white is paired with good things, you're really fast at sorting the task. And when African American is paired with negative attributes, you're really fast at sorting the task. And so that gets it's a reaction time speed test, and that gets at these sort of unconscious attitudes, because there's no real way to sort of fake this test.
And for comparison, you used also a population in Austria to have some sort of basis to compare the U.S. to a population in another country and sort of draw some conclusions from that. Tell us a little bit about that part.
Yeah, so there's another researcher I was working with over in Europe who's done some background research looking at how foreigners are represented in certain media in Austria. And what he found was a very similar pattern to how African Americans are presented in the news media here, which is foreigners are overrepresented as criminals or as sort of scary or threatening in these Austria tabloids. And so what he found was, very similar to the results here in the US, is overrepresentation. The people who read a lot of those tabloids had this bias against foreigners. And so it's the exact same pattern, just with different social groups based on the different types of news media. And so because of that, we can say that in two different contexts, we're getting the same sort of pattern. And so, the implications certainly are that if you're being exposed to these stereotypes, it's going to influence your bias.
So let's talk a little bit about the U.S. results. And you've talked about that correlation that exists where people in the U.S. who watch more local television news seem to have more of these unconscious negative attitudes towards African Americans. Is there a possibility here that we're dealing with correlation but not causation, in the sense that there may be some third factor which would tell us why those who for some other reason harbor these negative beliefs or attitudes towards African Americans are also simply consuming more local news?
Yes, and that's certainly, a possibility. Anytime you're just basing things on survey data of any sort, right? You've got a correlation, but you can't say, with certainty that this news use is causing this particular bias. In this particular study, we had a lot of other variables, socioeconomic variables, lots of things thrown in there to help eliminate other possibilities. So if it was just, your socioeconomic background that was causing that, then it would have eliminated this effect. So this effect was still there, despite all these other things, which gives us a little more certainty, but we can never be absolutely certain, other than there have been people who have done experiments where you've done manipulated news content where, different representations are shown in the news media, and that's shown to influence attitudes and then actually behaviors. And so, paired with other experimental data, it helps us, grow in confidence in that there is some sort of relationship here.
And how do you adjust in a study like this for the sort of reality that there are differing degrees, or there's a differing rate around the country, geographically speaking, to which we can attribute some of these attitudes towards minorities or African Americans as well? I mean, if we were to sort of plant the prevalence of certain attitudes on a map, we would see that certain parts of the country already seem to have a higher level than others.
Right. Yeah. And that's certainly true. This was a very specific population. I'm in Houston, so this was a Houston-based sample. So again, when we're extrapolating to the population, we can't say, that is necessarily happening in Seattle or even, Montgomery, Alabama. We don't know that for certain. Other than we do have this other population in Austria. So we do know, or we can, draw some conclusions that anywhere there's an overrepresentation of any sort of stereotype, then this effect is probably going to happen.
And talk to us a little bit about the implications of knowing this. I mean, obviously, we've been talking about problems with the sort of half-hour local news format, which when you take out commercials, it becomes 22 minutes.
Right.
A third of that is typically weather, 2 or 3 weather segments. And then you have a lot of, half of what's left is usually content that's produced nationally. So if it's an ABC affiliate, they'll air 1 or 2 stories from ABC National. That leaves very little actual local news, and it's predominantly crime stories, as you've alluded to in the study. What are some of the broader implications of this?
Yes, well, when we're talking about, because we measured both unconscious and conscious attitudes in this study, but we're more focused on the unconscious attitudes, in part because people know when they fill out, any sort of survey and it's asking you about prejudice, we know at this point in time that we shouldn't necessarily be honest, even if we have those feelings. And so we're focused more on the unconscious attitudes. But the implications of finding this relationship with unconscious attitudes is really important because the unconscious attitudes actually drive a lot of our behavior in an everyday setting. So something as simple as body language. We don't think about what body language we have when we're talking to somebody. That's very much driven by sort of an unconscious decision-making process. So if we have this unconscious bias, something as simple as our body language might change. And so we've seen there's other research that looks at things like body language of doctors can actually influence whether patients follow their orders. So there are a lot of ways that these unconscious attitudes can be important. And we even saw it last week. And obviously the details are still emerging exactly. But in the McKinney incident, where the cop pulls out this gun, perhaps because he, thought his life was in danger. And so that's going to be, these sort of split-second decisions are driven by unconscious attitudes because it's a very quick process that it's not a deliberative process where we're thinking about it. And so these unconscious attitudes are really important to study because they can have some really, serious implications in the real world.
No question about that. I'll remind everybody we're talking about Professor Temple Northup's study, Effects of Long-Term Exposure to News Stereotypes on Implicit and Explicit Attitudes. He's an assistant professor at the University of Houston. Such interesting work. Thank you so much for talking to us about it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
2 years ago, Elon Musk announced plans for this futuristic, high-speed Hyperloop transportation system. He says that he expects a 400-mile Hyperloop system connecting Los Angeles to San Francisco. It would take about 7 to 10 years to build. It would cost less than $6 billion, and it would cut what's a 5.5-hour drive down to about 30 minutes. The system could be solar powered. It would transport passengers in these enclosed capsules through low-pressure steel tubes at up to 800 miles an hour. The big news is that now Elon Musk has announced plans to build a mile-long test track in Hawthorne, California, and launch a competition for prototype transport pods, according to documents that have been obtained by Reuters. So SpaceX is the company involved. They're not going to build the system. What they're saying is we'll build a test track, and then teams of engineers or students or whoever can submit ideas and plans for what they want to test for the pods, and making it clear that SpaceX and Elon Musk will not be directly affiliated with the Hyperloop companies. They're just going to help accelerate the development. Fascinating, Lewis. I mean, this is just fantastic.
It is. It seems like an inevitable piece of technology, or at least something similar to it. We need it to happen. And can you imagine just having these crossing the entire country? How much easier life would be for a lot of people? Well,
it's going to be a long time before we see that. I mean, this is all 7 to 10 years just to develop a 400-mile track between San Francisco and LA. It reminds me a little bit of the infamous monorail episode on The Simpsons, a classic episode.
I actually don't recall that one.
Yeah, hopefully it works out better. Let me put it that way. It might make sense, though, with this technology to work on freight first, you know, develop the track and the technology, but keeping humans alive and comfortable is an additional level of complexity. So maybe it makes sense to look at transporting freight first in this way, although I understand that we already have more ways to transport freight maybe than we do public transit systems for humans.
I think both are very important, and I would just love for this to be what really gets the ball rolling with this type of technology.
Paul Ryan fell apart again on Fox News Sunday, and when he was pressed, he refused to say that he would guarantee Obamacare subsidies would stick around for people who might lose them. So Chris Wallace asked if Republicans would come up with a way to keep the Affordable Care Act subsidies going, because as you may know, Paul Ryan still wants to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. So now it's a very legitimate question. We have millions of people receiving subsidies for the Affordable Care Act through the Affordable Care Act, which allow them to afford health insurance. If you repeal the Affordable Care Act, will you guarantee that people will maintain the subsidies in some other way? And Paul Ryan listed a series of lies about Obamacare and refused to say, obviously, that those individuals would be able to keep the subsidies. Let's look at the video.
Question: if the court does rule against Obamacare, against these subsidies, says that they're illegal through the federal exchanges, will Republicans come up with a way, Republicans in Congress, to make sure that those 6 to 7 million people who depend on these subsidies in those 34 states are not left high and dry?
We will have an answer. We will have a solution. We don't want people to fall victim because of this bad law, and we want to give people freedom from Obamacare. We want to give people a bridge from Obamacare. So not only do we want to make sure that families don't suffer because of the failures of this law, we also want to give states the freedom to go their own direction and make it better. This law is failing. It's collapsing. Even if the court ruled for Obamacare, you still have a disaster on our hands. Double-digit premium increases. People are not getting what they want. So we want to give people more freedom, the ability to buy what they want to buy, which is what Obama said you could do, and gives the states more control.
But I want to. You're saying you guarantee the Republicans will come.
We will have a solution. Yes.
That will make sure that these 6 to 7 million people will be able to keep their subsidies.
We will have a solution that addresses this law, that gives people a bridge from Obamacare, and that addresses the people who are getting caught in the crossfire, that are getting caught in this ruling.
Well, that's what I want to ask you about.
We will have a solution that addresses people who are being caught in this solution. I won't go into all of the details because, quite frankly, Chris, we want to see the nature of the ruling. There are. No,
I understand that, but here's the question.
Here.
Here's the question, Congressman.
The answer is yes. We'll have a solution for the people who are caught up in this law, so that they're not left in the lurch.
But here's the question: will you demand an end to the mandates, the employer mandates, the individual mandates, which Secretary Burwell said in effect would amount to repealing Obamacare, and that the president would veto?
Well, I'm not going to get into all of that right now because we want to see what the ruling is, but we want to give people freedom from Obamacare.
They wouldn't be victims of a bad law the way that Paul Ryan is saying. They'd be victims of Paul Ryan repealing the law.
For how many years now have Republicans been saying that they need to get rid of Obamacare, that they have a plan? When pressed, none of them have ever had a plan. I have not heard one actual plan with any details about what they plan to do after repealing Obamacare.
If the Supreme Court gives conservatives the ruling that they want, then Republicans are actually in trouble, as Lewis is suggesting, because number one, the overwhelming more of the subsidies are in red states than in blue states, and number two, they don't have a plan, and that will be made very evident if the Supreme Court rules the way the right claims to want. There's something in Rand Paul's eyes and something about the way he talks.
Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan.
What did I say?
You said Rand Paul.
I'm sorry. In Paul Ryan. In Paul Ryan's eyes, that just lets you know he's full of it immediately, isn't there?
Yeah, he just strikes me as really dishonest. Well, we know he's really dishonest, and this interview is a perfect example of that. He's full of it. We can't say the word, but whatever it is, he's full of it.
Yeah, well, we're dealing with people's lives here, and it's just pro-corporate politics for these clowns. It's just fear-mongering and political posturing, and we're talking about people's health insurance. We're talking about people's lives. And I'm reminded of when Paul Ryan debated Joe Biden back in the 2012 presidential election, just an absolutely epic debate, where Paul Ryan just lied through the entire thing, ignorant or at least uncaring about the realities of what would happen to people if the policies he was pushing were made into law. Joe Biden laughed a couple of times during the debate, and Joe Biden was criticized, even though Paul Ryan lied through the entire thing, obvious lies that would really impact people.
And it's sad, but I think much of what he said and what he said right here in this interview, it's still talking points that a lot of people like hearing.
I know. I hate that some of these talking points still resonate with people. It is really scary.
Yeah, well, what can you do? I think we can all be glad that he's not running for president, at least not yet.
Yeah, at least not yet. We have a voicemail number, 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a voicemail I received. Let's take a listen.
Hey, David. This is Keith. I'm calling from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm an African-American voter, and I am with Bernie Sanders 100%, man. I know the social issues that he talks about are reflected upon the minority community. So, again, don't let that one woman kind of deter you from South Carolina that, all blacks are against Bernie Sanders. That's not true.
Yeah, so we had that story about how minorities are not necessarily taking to Bernie Sanders. And then a woman called in, an African-American woman from South Carolina, saying, basically, she didn't come out and say it, but it seemed pretty clear she thought Bernie Sanders was a Republican. And now we have this gentleman who called in saying, hey, I'm with Bernie. I understand what he's talking about. That's good. All anecdotal, of course. We'll see if the broader data shifts as the campaign continues. On today's bonus show, LeBron James says he's the best player in the world, the best basketball player in the world. Also, using Wi-Fi signals to power devices, and we'll talk about a baby born from the frozen ovary of his mother. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Go to davidpakman.com/membership to sign up today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.